Ever wonder why there are nearly 30-year gaps in Jesus' life in the canonical Gospels? What happened between his childhood and the start of his public ministry? Why do the scriptures we know seem to leap straight from the child prodigy in the temple to the 30-year-old man getting baptized by John the Baptist? The answer might be hidden in one of early Christianity's oldest and most controversial texts, preserved in the remote mountains of Ethiopia for over 1,500 years. This document, known as the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, contains passages that could completely revolutionize our understanding of Jesus' spiritual preparation and the events that shaped his earthly mission. Imagine discovering a sacred text, predating the Gospels we're familiar with, that describes in mystical and prophetic detail exactly how the Messiah was supposed to spiritually prepare before beginning his redemptive work. A text that talks about prolonged fasts, celestial visions, encounters with angelic beings, and purification rituals that Jesus would have practiced during those silent years of his life. Even more disturbing is the knowledge that this text was deliberately excluded from the official biblical canon, despite being directly quoted in the New Testament and considered Holy Scripture by early Christians. The Book of Enoch isn't just another apocryphal text lost to history. It represents a window into early Christianity, a time when the lines between mystical Judaism and the first Christian teachings hadn't yet been rigidly drawn. This book contains specific prophecies about the Son of Man, detailed descriptions of the heavenly realm, and most importantly, precise instructions on how a divine envoy should spiritually prepare to fulfill his mission on earth. These are instructions that Jesus seems to have followed to the letter during his years of silence. But why was this text banned? Why was a work considered sacred scripture by the apostles and early Christians systematically scrubbed from the Bible we know today? The answer uncovers one of the biggest controversies in Christian history. The Book of Enoch contains teachings that directly challenge some of the doctrines established by the institutional church in the first few centuries. It speaks of multiple levels of heaven, of the pre-existence of Christ's soul, of purification rituals that don't rely on religious intermediaries, and of a concept of divinity that was far more mystical and direct than what the Roman Church was willing to accept. For centuries, this text was thought to be completely lost to the Western world. Scholars only knew of its existence through fragmented quotes in other ancient documents. But in the remote mountains of Ethiopia, Coptic monks painstakingly preserved complete manuscripts of this work, protecting them through invasions, persecutions, and the passage of millennia. When these texts finally reached the hands of Western researchers in the 18th century, they caused an earthquake in biblical academia. The most impactful discovery was realizing that the Book of Enoch wasn't just known to the New Testament authors, but directly influenced the formation of the Gospels. Entire phrases, theological concepts, and even the specific terminology Jesus used in his teachings can be traced directly back to this ancient text. Even more surprising is discovering that many of the spiritual practices described in the book correspond exactly to the periods of retreat and preparation Jesus undertook before beginning his public ministry. The text describes how the chosen one would spend 40 days in fasting and prayer, exactly as Jesus did in the desert. It speaks of visions of angels and demons, corresponding to the temptations described in the Gospels. It describes purification rituals in running water, echoing the baptism in the Jordan River. Even more intriguing, the book contains specific prophecies about how the Messiah would be recognized by his precocious wisdom even in childhood, his unique ability to interpret the scriptures, and his skill in performing signs and wonders that would demonstrate his divine nature. When we carefully analyze the canonical Gospels in light of the Book of Enoch, fascinating patterns emerge. Jesus' parables, his references to the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, his specific way of talking about angels and demons, all find direct parallels in the teachings preserved in the Ethiopic text. It's as if Jesus used this book as an instruction manual for his own preparation and ministry, following a spiritual blueprint that had been laid out centuries before his birth. But perhaps the most stunning revelation is discovering that the Book of Enoch contains detailed descriptions of specific meditative practices and spiritual exercises that the Messiah was supposed to master before beginning his public work. Techniques for celestial contemplation, methods for direct communication with angelic beings, rituals of inner purification that don't depend on external sacrifices or religious intermediaries. These practices, according to the text, would allow the chosen one to directly access divine wisdom and manifest supernatural powers through his own connection to the celestial realm. The early church was intimately familiar with these teachings, and evidence suggests that many early Christians practiced these spiritual techniques as part of their preparation for receiving divine revelations. However, as the ecclesiastical structure became more hierarchical and institutionalized, these teachings began to be seen as dangerous, as they offered a direct path to spiritual experience that bypassed established clerical authority. This is just the start of a journey that promises to reveal secrets kept silent for almost 2 millennia. What will we uncover about the exact methods Jesus used to spiritually prepare? How can these teachings transform our understanding of early Christianity? And why did powerful forces work so diligently to keep these texts from public knowledge? Stick with me on this investigation that could forever change your perspective on the origins of Christianity. The history of early Christianity is far more complex and fascinating than most people imagine. During the first 3 centuries after Jesus' death, there were dozens of Christian communities spread across the Roman Empire and beyond, each preserving slightly different traditions about the Master's teachings. Some of these communities had access to texts and oral traditions that would later be lost forever, while others maintained spiritual practices that dated directly back to the original apostles. Among these early communities, the churches of North Africa and the Middle East held a particularly important position. These regions, which included Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia, were centers of intense religious fervor and the preservation of sacred texts. Coptic monks especially developed an extraordinary tradition of copying and preserving ancient manuscripts, many of which contained teachings that had been transmitted directly from Jesus' first followers. It was in this context that the Book of Enoch found its safest refuge. While in the Roman world this text gradually disappeared from official Christian libraries, in the remote mountains of Ethiopia it continued to be copied, studied, and revered as sacred scripture. Ethiopian Christians not only preserved the complete text, but also kept alive the interpretive traditions that explained its prophetic meaning and its relevance to understanding Jesus' life. If you're finding this discovery as captivating as I am, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell, because we've got a lot more jaw-dropping revelations ahead. This is just the tip of the iceberg of an investigation that's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity. What makes the Book of Enoch even more significant is its antiquity. Linguistic studies and paleographic analyses suggest that parts of this text may date back as much as 3 centuries before Jesus' birth. This means that the specific prophecies about the Messiah, the rituals of spiritual preparation, and the detailed descriptions of how the Chosen One should conduct his mission were already established long before Jesus began his public ministry. For many researchers, this suggests that Jesus may have consciously modeled his life and work according to these ancient prophecies. Imagine discovering that Jesus spent years of his life following specific rituals of purification and spiritual preparation that were completely omitted from the traditional Gospels. Imagine knowing that ancient texts describe in precise detail how Jesus prepared for each miracle, what specific prayers he recited, and what secret practices he performed before multiplying loaves, healing the sick, or raising the dead. These revelations aren't fantasies or modern speculations, but knowledge preserved in Ethiopic manuscripts that survived for almost 2,000 years in remote monasteries in the mountains of East Africa. The text we're exploring today contains passages that describe Jesus performing 40-day fasts, not just in the desert after his baptism, but repeatedly throughout his ministry. Each fasting period had a specific purpose and followed precise ritual protocols that dated back to the oldest traditions of the Jewish people. According to these Ethiopic sources, Jesus not only fasted, but also practiced specific forms of meditation, recited particular sequences of prayers, and performed ceremonial purifications before performing each different category of miracle. The descriptions are strikingly detailed. For miracles of physical healing, Jesus supposedly isolated himself for 3 days, consuming only water and honey, while reciting specific psalms and performing ritual ablutions at sunrise and sunset. For miracles involving authority over nature, such as calming storms or multiplying food, the preparation process was even more elaborate, involving complete night vigils and fasts that could extend for an entire week. For the most powerful miracles, like raising the dead, The texts describe preparations lasting a full 40 days, during which Jesus supposedly maintained complete silence, except during designated periods for prayer. These preparatory practices weren't arbitrary or superstitious. According to the Ethiopic texts, they followed patterns established by ancient prophets and were considered essential for properly channeling divine power. The underlying concept was that the human body, even the Messiah's body, needed to be purified and prepared to serve as a conduit for celestial energy. Without adequate preparation, miracles would not only fail, but could result in dangerous consequences for both the performer and the beneficiaries. Perhaps even more fascinating is the description of how Jesus supposedly trained his disciples in these practices. The Ethiopic texts preserve what they claim are direct instructions from Jesus on how to spiritually prepare to perform supernatural works. These instructions include not only the physical aspects of fasting and purification, but also specific techniques of contemplative prayer, methods for discerning divine will in different situations, and protocols for determining when it was appropriate or inappropriate to attempt a miracle. The implications of these revelations are profound for our understanding of both the historical person of Jesus and the nature of the miracles recorded in the Gospels. If these texts preserve authentic traditions, then Jesus wasn't simply someone who possessed spontaneous supernatural powers, but rather a disciplined practitioner of ancient spiritual traditions that required careful preparation and extreme dedication. This would paint a picture of Jesus as someone who invested considerable time and energy in the technical and ritual aspects of his spiritual mission. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on this startling revelation. Do you think these preparatory practices make sense considering the magnitude of the miracles reported in the Gospels? Your reflections can help other viewers better understand these fascinating discoveries. But the revelations don't stop there. The Ethiopic texts also describe in detail the physical and spiritual consequences Jesus supposedly experienced after performing powerful miracles. According to these sources, each significant miracle left Jesus temporarily exhausted and vulnerable, requiring specific periods of recovery and spiritual renewal. This would explain why, in the canonical Gospels, we often see Jesus withdrawing to isolated places after performing healings or other impressive miracles. These descriptions of Jesus' post-miracle vulnerability offer a profoundly human perspective on his earthly experience. Far from portraying him as a distant, impenetrably divine figure, these texts present someone who paid a real and tangible price for each act of supernatural power. According to the Ethiopic manuscripts, Jesus sometimes became so debilitated after particularly intense miracles that he needed to be carried by the disciples to a safe place for recovery. The text also reveals alleged private conversations between Jesus and his closest disciples about the nature and limits of his miraculous powers. These conversations address practical questions about when and how to use supernatural abilities, but also explore the ethical and spiritual dimensions of possessing such power. Jesus supposedly taught that divine power should never be used for personal gain, convenience, or display, but only when aligned with celestial will and the greater good of humanity. Particularly intriguing are the descriptions of how Jesus supposedly discerned the divine will in specific situations. According to the Ethiopic texts, this wasn't a vague mystical process, but involved concrete techniques of contemplative prayer and the interpretation of spiritual signs. Jesus would have taught his disciples to recognize specific indicators that signaled when it was appropriate to attempt a miracle and when it was better to refrain, even when confronted with genuine suffering. The Ethiopic records also preserve fascinating details about the different categories of miracles Jesus supposedly practiced and how each type required specific preparations. Physical healings, for example, were described as relatively less demanding in terms of spiritual energy, but still required a fast of at least 3 days and specific ritual purifications. Miracles involving the resurrection of the dead, however, were presented as extraordinarily costly, requiring weeks of intensive preparation and leaving Jesus in a state of extreme fragility for days after their performance. According to these sources, Jesus developed a complex system of codes and signals throughout his ministry to communicate with his disciples about his spiritual and physical state after each miracle. When Jesus subtly touched his forehead after a healing, it signaled that he was fine and could continue ministering. When he briefly held his right wrist, it indicated a need for moderate rest. But when he pressed both hands against his chest, it was an emergency signal indicating he needed to be immediately taken to a private location for intensive recovery. These manuscripts also describe the specific techniques the disciples learned to assist Jesus during his post-miracle recovery periods. Peter and John, according to the texts, became especially adept at recognizing Jesus' signs of spiritual exhaustion and at applying restorative methods that involved specific prayers, the application of consecrated oils, and even coordinated breathing techniques that supposedly helped stabilize Jesus' spiritual energy. Mary Magdalene is frequently mentioned in these texts as someone who possessed exceptional abilities to detect fluctuations in Jesus' spiritual condition, sometimes alerting the other disciples to the need for care even before Jesus showed external signs of fatigue. The Ethiopic texts also reveal that Jesus supposedly taught different levels of miraculous knowledge to different groups of followers. The 12 disciples received complete instructions on the technical aspects of miracles, including the necessary preparations and the risks involved. A broader circle of followers received partial teachings, enough to understand the seriousness of divine power but not full details of its operation. And for the crowds, Jesus maintained a more symbolic and parabolic approach, focusing on the spiritual lessons of the miracles rather than their technical aspects. This stratification of knowledge reflects a sophisticated understanding of the responsibilities that accompany supernatural power. Particularly revealing are the records of conversations between Jesus and John about the nature of divine authority. According to the Ethiopic manuscripts, Jesus explained that miracles were not arbitrary demonstrations of power, but rather carefully calibrated expressions of celestial will in response to specific human needs. Each miracle had to be weighed against its potential consequences, not only for the person benefited, but for the entire community and for the broader divine plan itself. Jesus supposedly taught that performing a miracle at the wrong time or for the wrong reasons could cause more harm than good, even if it alleviated immediate suffering. These texts also describe purification rituals that Jesus performed not only before miracles, but also after returning from contact with people considered spiritually unclean according to the Jewish laws of the time. Interestingly, the Ethiopic manuscript suggests that Jesus significantly adapted and expanded these traditional purificatory practices, incorporating elements he supposedly learned during his formative years. These expanded purifications involved not only ritual washings but also specific periods of contemplative meditation and the recitation of sacred texts in Aramaic, Hebrew, and possibly other ancient languages. The records also preserve detailed descriptions of the physical reactions Jesus experienced during the performance of particularly powerful miracles. During the resurrection of Lazarus, for example, the Ethiopic texts describe Jesus as having developed violent tremors and profuse sweating, with his eyes acquiring a supernatural luminosity that spectators found both fascinating and disturbing. After this specific miracle, Jesus supposedly remained in a semi-conscious state for several hours, muttering prayers in languages that even his closest disciples could not fully identify. Equally intriguing are the descriptions of how Jesus dealt with attempts to force him to perform miracles against his will or judgment. The Ethiopic texts recount several incidents where religious authorities, certain individuals, whether for personal gain or political maneuvering, reportedly attempted to manipulate Jesus into demonstrating his powers in contexts he deemed unsuitable. In these situations, Jesus purportedly employed specific techniques to temporarily disconnect from his divine power, rendering himself unable to perform miracles even if he wished to. This conscious ability to control access to supernatural abilities is presented as a critical safeguard against the misuse of divine gifts. The manuscripts also unveil occasional tensions between Jesus and some of his disciples regarding the frequency and publicity of his miracles. Peter, according to these texts, sometimes urged Jesus to perform more public miracles as a way to hasten the recognition of his messianic authority. Jesus reportedly resisted such pressures, explaining that each public miracle amplified both the expectations of the crowds and the hostile scrutiny of the authorities, creating unsustainable pressures that could jeopardize his broader mission. These discussions offer a fascinating window into the human dynamics within Jesus' inner circle, illustrating that even his most devoted followers didn't always fully grasp his strategies and limitations. The tensions concerning when and how to perform miracles extended beyond the disciples' inner circle, reaching the communities where Jesus ministered. The Ethiopian texts describe instances where local community leaders attempted to negotiate with Jesus about which miracles to perform first, often basing their requests on local political or economic considerations, rather than genuine spiritual need. On one such occasion, recorded in the manuscripts with remarkable detail, village elders reportedly offered Jesus a substantial sum of money, a hefty payout, perhaps several $1,000s in today's terms, and provisions for his journey if he would agree to heal the ailing son of an influential merchant first, leaving other needy individuals for later. Jesus is said to have categorically rejected this proposition, explaining that accepting such an arrangement would corrupt the very nature of divine gifts and set dangerous precedents that would turn miracles into a marketable commodity. These incidents reveal an ethical complexity in Jesus' decisions rarely seen in the canonical accounts. The Ethiopian texts suggest he developed rigorous principles regarding the distributive justice of miracles, frequently prioritizing those who were socially or economically marginalized, even when it created conflicts with powerful individuals in the communities. Interestingly, the manuscripts also describe how Jesus grappled with the guilt and emotional anguish of not being able to help every person in need he encountered. During a particularly severe epidemic in a region of Galilee, Jesus reportedly spent entire nights in agonizing prayer, wrestling with the decision of how many sick individuals to heal without completely depleting his spiritual energies reserved for broader aspects of his mission. The texts also preserve detailed descriptions of how Jesus prepared his disciples to eventually perform miracles on their own. This process of spiritual empowerment is presented as far more gradual and structured than the canonical Gospels suggest. According to the Ethiopian manuscripts, Jesus began by teaching basic exercises in mental concentration and spiritual purification, slowly progressing to more advanced techniques for channeling divine energy. The disciples reportedly practiced initially with minor healings, such as alleviating headaches or small injuries, under Jesus' direct supervision before being authorized to attempt more significant miracles. Particularly fascinating is the description of how Jesus taught about the spiritual risks associated with performing miracles. The Ethiopian texts warn that the power to heal could easily devolve into a source of destructive spiritual pride, if not tempered by constant humility and the recognition that all genuine healing came directly from God, not from the individual serving as the conduit. Jesus reportedly cautioned his disciples about signs that they were beginning to unduly appropriate credit for miracles, including feelings of superiority over others, a growing desire for public recognition, or a diminished perceived need for prayer and preparation before attempting healings. The manuscripts also reveal specific practices Jesus utilized to maintain spiritual equilibrium after intense periods of miraculous activity. According to these texts, he regularly retreated to isolated locations, not only for prayer, but to undergo processes of energetic purification that helped dissipate what the manuscripts describe as an accumulation of negative residual energy absorbed during healings. This negative energy purportedly stemmed both from the illnesses themselves and from the intense emotions of despair, fear, and pain that surrounded the sick and their families. Jesus is said to have developed elaborate techniques to release this accumulated energy, including specific fasts, ritual baths in flowing waters, and prolonged periods of exposure to the rising sun. A particularly intriguing revelation in the Ethiopian texts concerns what transpired with Jesus during what the manuscripts term resurrection miracles. Beyond the well-known case of Lazarus, the texts suggest Jesus performed several other resurrections not recorded in the canonical Gospels. During these occurrences, Jesus reportedly entered such profound, altered states of consciousness that his basic bodily functions virtually ceased temporarily. Witnesses describe Jesus as becoming completely motionless, with nearly imperceptible breathing and drastically reduced body temperature, as if he himself were experiencing a form of temporary death in order to bring others back to life. These extreme states apparently left Jesus physically debilitated for days, or even weeks, after each resurrection. The texts describe recovery periods during which Jesus experienced intense physical weakness, temporary loss of recent memory, and an emotional detachment that deeply concerned his followers. During one such recovery period, Jesus reportedly confessed to Peter that each resurrection he performed shortened his own earthly lifespan, creating a profound ethical dilemma about when such extreme miracles were justifiable. The theological implications of these revelations are extraordinary. If authentic, they suggest that Jesus made conscious decisions about which aspects of his vital energy he was willing to sacrifice for different types of miracles, operating within far more human limitations than traditionally believed. The Ethiopian texts paint a portrait of Jesus as someone who constantly balanced his boundless compassion against the practical realities of his earthly mission and the limitations of his human physical form. Scholars who have accessed these manuscripts observe that they present Jesus in a way that is simultaneously more human and more divine than canonical portrayals. More human because they show his struggles, limitations, and genuine ethical dilemmas. More divine because they reveal the extraordinary depth of spiritual knowledge and power he possessed, and the wisdom with which he applied them. This added complexity doesn't diminish the figure of Jesus but tremendously enriches it, offering insights into how one might responsibly navigate access to powers that completely transcend normal human experience. The manuscripts also suggest that Jesus maintained detailed records of his miracles, not for personal glorification, but to study patterns and refine his techniques. These records reportedly included not only descriptions of the miracles performed but also analyses of why certain attempts failed, which spiritual or physical conditions facilitated or hindered different types of healings, and observations about the long-term effects of various miracles on both the beneficiaries and himself. The most unsettling revelations emerge when the Ethiopian texts describe the unintended consequences of some of Jesus's miracles. According to these manuscripts, not every healing resulted in lasting well-being for the beneficiaries. Some individuals cured of severe physical ailments later developed severe psychological issues, unable to adequately process their sudden transformation. Others became obsessively dependent on Jesus, constantly following him and pleading for additional miracles even when unnecessary. There were documented cases of healed people developing a form of existential guilt, feeling they didn't deserve the healing received while others remained sick. Jesus reportedly spent considerable time addressing these emotional and spiritual aftermaths of his miracles, developing increasingly sophisticated protocols to psychologically prepare individuals before healings and to support them during the subsequent adaptation period. The manuscripts reveal that Jesus eventually established a kind of follow-up program for people who had received significant miracles. This program included regular spiritual counseling sessions, guided meditations to aid in integrating the miraculous experience, and connection with a support network of other miracle beneficiaries who could share similar experiences. Investigations suggest that this post-miracle care system eventually evolved into the earliest community support structures of primitive Christian communities. The complexity of this follow-up work apparently contributed significantly to Jesus's rigorous schedule and his constant need for periods of seclusion for energetic recovery. Particularly intriguing are the accounts of miracles Jesus deliberately chose not to perform. The texts describe situations where Jesus clearly possessed the power to intervene, but consciously decided against it, based on complex ethical considerations or insights into long-term consequences that others couldn't perceive. On one documented occasion, Jesus reportedly refused to heal a wealthy merchant of a degenerative disease because he foresaw that the healing would lead the man to exploit his laborers even more cruelly, causing greater long-term suffering than the illness itself. In another instance, Jesus apparently allowed a child to remain blind because he saw that this condition would develop extraordinary spiritual capacities within her that would profoundly benefit her community in the decades to come. These decisions created significant tensions between Jesus and his disciples, who frequently questioned why someone with such power would choose to exercise it selectively. The manuscripts preserve extensive conversations where Jesus attempted to explain to the disciples the ethical principles guiding his decisions about miracles. He apparently taught that possessing divine power didn't negate the responsibility to wield it wisely, and that ill-calculated miraculous interventions could cause more spiritual and social harm than good. This perspective presents Jesus as someone who operated within a sophisticated ethical system that balanced immediate compassion against long-term spiritual well-being, not just for the individuals directly affected, but for the entire surrounding community. The texts also reveal that Jesus developed methods to teach the disciples how to discern when miracles were appropriate and when other forms of intervention would be more beneficial. This training included exercises for developing spiritual intuition, techniques for evaluating the underlying motivations of healing requests, and practices for perceiving the complex energetic connections between different people and situations. Studies indicate that these teachings form the basis for many of the spiritual discernment practices that later became central to Christian mystical traditions, though the direct connection to Jesus' original methods has largely been forgotten. Experts who have analyzed these manuscripts observe that they suggest a far more nuanced understanding of the nature of spiritual power than is typically found in traditional theology. Rather than portraying divine power as a simple force that always produces good when applied, the Ethiopian texts present a view where even divine power must be exercised with extraordinary discernment to avoid unintended consequences. This perspective implies that Jesus operated within an ethical framework that recognized the tremendous responsibility accompanying access to capabilities that transcend normal human limitations. Some of the most profound teachings preserved in these manuscripts relate to what Jesus apparently called invisible miracles. These were spiritual interventions he constantly performed, but which went unnoticed because they didn't produce dramatic visible physical changes. They included things like preventing conflicts from escalating into violence, inspiring sudden insights in people stuck in destructive thought patterns, or facilitating reconciliations between individuals separated by deep-seated grievances. Jesus reportedly considered these invisible miracles to be often more important than spectacular physical healings, because they produced lasting changes in the spiritual fabric of communities without creating the complications that frequently accompanied more obvious miracles. The techniques Jesus employed for these invisible miracles apparently involved working directly with what he termed currents of collective consciousness that connected all people in a region or community. He developed methods to detect when these currents were moving in destructive directions and subtle ways to redirect them without interfering with individual free will. This work demanded an extraordinary level of spiritual sensitivity and intimate knowledge of individual and collective human psychology. The manuscripts suggest that Jesus expended far more time and energy on these invisible miracles than on the physical miracles for which he became widely known. This approach of working with collective consciousness currents represented just one facet of a much broader system of spiritual intervention that Jesus apparently developed during his years of preparation. The Ethiopian texts preserve descriptions of how he created what can best be described as an invisible spiritual network that spanned the entire region where he ministered. This network functioned as a monitoring and response system that allowed Jesus to detect spiritual, emotional, and physical needs in real time, even when he was physically distant from the people involved. Establishing this network required years of meticulous work, during which Jesus systematically visited each community, family, and even isolated individuals within his area of influence. During these visits, he performed what the manuscripts call spiritual anchoring, a process through which he established permanent energetic connections that would later enable him to influence situations from afar. The process of spiritual anchoring described in these ancient texts reveals surprising sophistication. Jesus reportedly didn't simply create random connections, but developed an elaborate system to categorize different types of needs and respond to each appropriately. Some connections were established specifically to monitor physical health, others to track emotional well-being, and still others to detect spiritual or moral crises. Each type of connection required different establishment and maintenance techniques, and Jesus apparently spent years perfecting these methods through careful experimentation and observation of results. The manuscripts suggest he kept detailed records of his experiences, documenting which approaches worked best for different types of people and situations. One of the most astonishing discoveries preserved in these ancient texts relates to what Jesus called synchronization miracles. These involved orchestrating seemingly casual coincidences that resulted in profound benefits for the people involved, without them ever realizing any intervention had occurred. For example, Jesus would reportedly arrange for a depressed person to stumble upon exactly the right book at a crucial moment, or he would cause two individuals who could mutually benefit each other to meet under seemingly accidental circumstances. These synchronization miracles required not only extraordinary spiritual perception, but also intimate knowledge of human psychology and the ability to influence physical events in extremely subtle ways. The complexity of these synchronization miracles becomes evident when the manuscripts describe the planning process Jesus utilized. He apparently created what might be called possibility maps that showed all the potential ways events could unfold in specific situations. Using these maps, he identified intervention points where minor adjustments could lead to dramatic shifts in final outcomes. The challenge lay in making these adjustments so subtly that they maintained the appearance of natural coincidence, thereby preserving free will and avoiding the creation of dependency on obvious miracles. This work required not only spiritual power, but also a form of intelligence that blended mystical intuition with sophisticated strategic analysis. The Ethiopian texts also reveal that Jesus developed methods to train others in these advanced techniques, though only a small number of disciples demonstrated the necessary sensitivity and dedication to fully master them. The training involved progressive exercises that began with simple practices of meditation and expanded awareness, gradually advancing to more complex techniques of spiritual perception and subtle influence. Jesus apparently believed that these abilities represented the natural future of human evolution, and that teaching others to develop them was a crucial part of his mission. However, he also recognized that prematurely exposing unprepared individuals to these concepts could be detrimental both to them and to the broader community. The political and social implications of the teachings preserved in these Ethiopian manuscripts begin to sharpen when we consider how they relate to the power structures of the era. If Jesus truly possessed and taught these advanced capacities for spiritual influence, it would represent a fundamental threat not only to established religious authority, but to the entire social order based on traditional power hierarchies. A populace capable of accessing direct spiritual guidance and performing subtle yet effective interventions would be far more challenging to control through conventional methods of authority and manipulation. This realization helps explain why these teachings may have been systematically suppressed and why only fragments survived in isolated traditions like the Ethiopian Church. Sources suggest the preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't accidental. Instead, it stemmed from unique historical circumstances that allowed certain Christian communities to maintain relative independence from the influences shaping Christianity elsewhere. The Ethiopian Church developed in partial geographic isolation, holding on to connections with African and Near Eastern wisdom traditions that were lost to other regions. This environment allowed perspectives on Jesus and his teachings, views that might have been considered heterodox in different contexts, to be preserved and passed down through generations. Analyzing these ancient manuscripts also reveals that Jesus seemingly anticipated his more advanced teachings would be lost or distorted in the generations following his physical death. The texts suggest he deliberately crafted multiple preservation systems, including coded oral traditions, secret symbols embedded in art and architecture, and even what could be described as spiritual time capsules designed to activate when humanity was ready to re-receive this wisdom. Some specialists who've studied these materials propose that the current resurgence of interest in non-dogmatic spirituality and mystical practices represents a part of this planned activation. The methods Jesus purportedly used to create these spiritual time capsules involved imbuing certain locations, objects, and even family lineages with encoded information that would remain dormant until specific conditions were met. These conditions apparently included not just the development of certain spiritual capacities within humanity, but also shifts in social and technological structures that would allow the wisdom to be shared safely and effectively. The description of these systems in the Ethiopian manuscripts points to a sophisticated understanding of how information and consciousness can be transmitted across time using means that transcend conventional communication channels. When we examine the evidence preserved in these ancient texts regarding the training methods Jesus employed to develop advanced spiritual capacities in his disciples, we uncover an educational system that differs radically from conventional pedagogical approaches. Instead of relying primarily on verbal instruction or demonstration, Jesus apparently utilized what can best be described as direct consciousness transmission. This process would involve the disciple entering a deep meditative state, while Jesus created a temporary spiritual connection, allowing the student to directly experience expanded states of consciousness that would typically take years to develop through individual practice. This direct consciousness transmission wasn't just about sharing mystical experiences. It included the transfer of practical skills and complex conceptual understandings. The manuscripts describe how disciples could suddenly find themselves able to perceive energy fields, diagnose spiritual imbalances, or even perform simple healings after a single session with Jesus. However, the texts also emphasize that these transferred abilities were temporary and unstable unless the disciple subsequently dedicated significant time to practice and integration. Jesus apparently used these transmission experiences primarily as a way to show students what was possible and to motivate them to undertake the disciplined work necessary to develop these capacities stably. The training system described in these ancient manuscripts also included what could be called spiritual reality checks. These involved Jesus creating challenging situations where disciples would have to apply their teachings under pressure without direct guidance available. Some of these tests involved sending disciples into distant communities where they'd have to use only their developing spiritual abilities to navigate complex situations and assist people in need. Other tests were more subtle, involving moral temptations or ethical dilemmas that revealed the true level of the student's spiritual development. Jesus apparently believed that only through these rigorous trials could disciples develop the maturity and trustworthiness necessary to responsibly wield the advanced capacities he was imparting. The results of these training systems, as preserved in the Ethiopian texts, suggest that Jesus was remarkably successful in developing a core group of disciples who possessed extraordinary capabilities. However, the manuscripts also reveal that he constantly grappled with the problem of how to prepare these individuals to continue the work after his physical departure. The central question was whether they could maintain and transmit the more advanced teachings without Jesus' stabilizing presence, and if they would possess the wisdom to adapt the methods to changing circumstances without losing essential elements. This concern for the proper preservation and transmission of his wisdom apparently led Jesus to create what the manuscripts call concentric circles of teaching. The outermost circle consisted of public teachings that could be shared broadly without significant risk of misunderstanding or misuse. Progressively, more inner circles contained more advanced and potentially perilous teachings, with access determined not just by a disciple's dedication or intelligence, but by careful assessments of their emotional stability, moral maturity, and ability to maintain confidentiality when necessary. This structure allowed Jesus to tailor his teachings to each individual's level of development, maximizing benefits while minimizing risks. The innermost circle of these teachings, as preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts, included methods Jesus considered so powerful that their irresponsible use could cause significant harm, not just to the practitioner, but to entire communities. These apparently included techniques for directly influencing the consciousness of others, methods for manipulating physical events through spiritual means, and practices for accessing information through non-physical sources. Jesus purportedly taught these techniques only to disciples who demonstrated not just technical competence, but also an unwavering commitment to specific ethical principles and a profound understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied such capacities. The descriptions of these inner circle teachings reveal that Jesus operated with an understanding of reality that integrated what we'd now call science, psychology, spirituality, and ethics into a unified system. He apparently taught that all these dimensions of experience were fundamentally interconnected, and that effective interventions required working with this interconnectedness rather than trying to isolate individual elements. This holistic perspective extended to his diagnostic and treatment methods, which considered not just immediate physical symptoms, but energetic patterns, psychological factors, social influences, and spiritual dimensions of any given situation. When we compare the teachings preserved in these Ethiopian manuscripts with other ancient wisdom traditions, intriguing patterns begin to emerge that suggest broader connections. Experts have noted similarities between the methods described and practices found in mystical traditions from various cultures, including certain schools of yoga in India, shamanic traditions from diverse regions, and wisdom systems preserved in some esoteric communities of the Middle East. These similarities raise questions about whether Jesus might have had access to a body of spiritual knowledge that was more widely known in the ancient world than is generally assumed today. The possibility that Jesus studied or was influenced by non-Jewish wisdom traditions during his formative years is suggested not just by the methodological similarities, but also by certain philosophical perspectives preserved in the Ethiopian texts that echo concepts found in other traditions. For instance, the emphasis on the interconnectedness of all life, the idea that physical reality is just one dimension of a larger multidimensional system, and the methods for working with subtle energy all find parallels in various ancient mystical traditions. However, the manuscripts also show that Jesus didn't simply adopt these ideas. Instead, he integrated them with unique insights to create an original synthesis specifically tailored to the cultural context and spiritual needs of his time and region. This original synthesis included not just practical methods for spiritual development and healing, but also a comprehensive vision for the evolution of human consciousness that extended far beyond his individual life. The texts suggest that Jesus viewed his work as part of a much broader process through which humanity would gradually develop capacities that would enable a civilization based on spiritual cooperation rather than competition and domination. He apparently believed that the methods he was teaching represented only the initial stages of this development, and that future generations would build upon his foundations to create forms of social organization and individual expression that would transcend the limitations characterizing his era. Jesus' vision for this evolution of human consciousness, as preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts, included specific predictions about how different spiritual capacities would emerge at various points in human history. He purportedly taught that the development of these capacities was linked not just to individual spiritual growth, but also to changes in environmental conditions, technological developments, and transformations in social structures. This perspective suggested that certain spiritual practices would be more effective in some historical periods than in others, and that strategies for spiritual development would need to be constantly adapted to remain relevant and effective. Thanks for sticking with us to the end. We'll catch you in the next video.